everyone, I'm Carlene Jackson.
And I'm Zoe England.
Thanks for listening to Marketing Decanted for SMEs, the podcast from Cloud9 Insight created to be an essential guide to small business marketing. On today's episode, we're talking to Bill Wallsgrove. He's a brand consultant with over 30 years' experience in the design industry. He was creative director at Coley, Porter, Bell and Futurebrand before starting digital marketing businesses including Big Idea and Brand Voice. Bill specialises in providing strategic and creative advice to businesses with a focus on SMEs, startups and new product development. He works with clients to create digital-first brands through a series of seminars and workshops. He's a visiting lecturer at a number of colleges, universities, specialising in brand practice and history, personal branding, and colour theory. Thanks for joining and enjoy the episode. Hi Zoe, how are you today?
I'm great, Carlene. How are you doing?
I'm great. What have you been up to this week?
What have I been up to? I've been doing quite a lot of cooking this week. So, focusing on some new recipes, which has been exciting. What about you?
I did just bake an apple Dorset cake this morning. So,
oh, lovely.
Yeah, I don't think this lockdown's going to be great for my waistline, but, but there we go. Today we've got Bill joining us. How are you doing today, Bill?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be involved in supporting businesses with their brand strategy.
Yeah, well, I describe myself as a brand consultant because I work for a number of agencies and a number of clients direct. And I focus on design thinking for digital first brands, which I'll explain later. But like a lot of people, where I am now, where I started is completely different. And of course, when I started as a graphic designer at art college last century, I thought I was going to end up working in advertising. But through various twists and turns, I started working in branding agencies and loved the practice so much. I've kind of focused on that as an owner of agencies in London, which have been bought and sold. And I've been an independent really for the last 6 or 7 years.
That sounds great, Bill. So if you think about brand and PR as being part of marketing per se, what are you seeing in terms of sort of trends at the moment that are happening in your world?
Yeah, well, I don't see branding as being part of marketing. I think branding comes long before marketing, and there's reasons. There's a history to that, which I'm happy to explain. I'm involved in helping companies name themselves, create their identity, create their brand, and they can't really go to market until they've actually defined what their brand is. So I would say that branding is it's lighting the blue touch paper before you do any marketing. In terms of trends, of course, I've described earlier that I work for digital first brands. Now, of course, that's not always been the case because obviously the digital world has changed rapidly over the last 25 years. But more and more, the brands that I work on are having to think about all the digital touch points they have to go through to engage with audiences now. And it's not talking about digital marketing. It's just to say that if they don't think about the content they've got to create and they don't understand where the audiences they're trying to reach are gathering, they won't have the right material to engage with those audiences. So a lot of the work we do, particularly for SMEs and startup companies, is to create a brand world for them. So it's not just a logo, of course, it's a brand identity, it's a brand visual language, it's a tone of voice, and it's how they talk about their product or their service to their consumers. So digital first branding is really not just what I'm involved in, but it's certainly part of the industry, the branding industry as a whole.
So when you start working with your customers, I'm guessing the fact that they've probably already recognized they need a brand, is that the case? Or do you sort of, when you see small businesses out there, how common is it that you feel that they've actually they have a good grasp of what brand is and the importance of it for their business?
Well, you see, that's the point. You see, every business should be a brand. If it's not a brand, I don't know how it can market itself because the brand is, if you like, the step one. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was working for a charity in the health sector. I was invited to help them on their branding and help redesign their website. And when I was speaking to a room full of the board of this charity, they were all doctors and surgeons and physicians with lots of letters behind their name. And I sort of gave them the Jack and Jill version of what branding is. And they were all very interested. And at the end, the chairman said, we're not a brand, we're a charity. We're not a brand at all. I worked for them for 6 months. And we did redesign their website and created a much more powerful brand for them. And we started to get a lot more investment coming into the charity, a lot more donations. And as I was leaving, the chairman said to me, "Bill, I hear you're leaving. You're leaving at the end of the week. What are we going to do with our brand?" So I felt to myself, after 6 months, a man who didn't know he had a brand, now that was scared he was losing the person who'd been managing his brand. So it's a very kind of interesting, and I'll explain why that's important a little later.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Bill, because that's sort of clarified in my mind that brand actually is key to everything, isn't it? If you're running a business. So talk to us a little bit about what you do in that scenario then. So I guess if a business wants some help with brand, you go in and you do your stuff for say 6 months. Then what happens after that? What's the journey look like for them as a business?
Well, if you're creating a brand, you've got to create a set of brand guidelines for them. So, as I say, the businesses that don't seem to grasp what branding is tend to think of branding as being a logo or a name or a colour or very simple things, rather than a way of thinking. You know, a brand is a promise, and your promise has to be delivered, and it has to be delivered in every aspect of what you do. So you tend to create a set of guidelines which helps both the internal audience, which is hugely important, but also external users of the brand. You explain to them the tone of voice, the elements they've got to use, the things they must stick to, the guidelines they must stay up upon. Because if they don't stick with certain things, then the brand gets diffused, and it starts. The very best brands in the world are heavily policed. You know, if you think of something like Apple, which is one of my favorite brands and probably the brand that everyone uses as an exemplar, it is very pure about how it considers it branding, whether it be the machines you use, the packaging you receive, the shop experience, the online experience. It has a purity to it. And it's probably been at the vanguard of how people are thinking about brand marketing over the last 10 years or so.
I think that's a great point. I think that brand is becoming almost like an umbrella, which there's lots of different elements, as you said, sort of how things are packaged, designed, and importantly, also the customer experience. And I think that's becoming more and more important for companies. I've heard that actually the sort of experience that you deliver for your customers is becoming more important, a more important focus for marketeers to deliver a competitive advantage. And it's, I think, in these times of sort of when we're in lockdown and people are buying more online, I've certainly seen my 16-year-old son. He says, like, I'm not buying from them. I've never heard of that brand. We need to trust the companies that we're buying from to ensure that we're not scammed and that we get the product. So I think for more and more organizations, it'll be really important to make sure they've got a trusted brand. And I'm intrigued to know, what's your advice for an organization that hasn't really done any sort of work on their brand? It's just exists as it is. It's never really been sort of, they've not sat down in a workshop, for example, and defined it. It's just sort of come about. What's your advice for taking it back to the basics and defining their brand? What's involved in that process?
It's a really great question, because a lot of the work we do, if we're not working on startups, we're working on what I call legacy brands. And those are brands that were probably designed some years ago, usually in a print-based economy, and haven't really thought about how they use the best platforms to describe their brand online. So what a brand workshop often is in that case, a brand workshop for a startup business is great fun because it's a blank sheet of paper. But a brand workshop for an existing legacy brand is usually the equivalent of a health check or an MOT. So we use certain brand principles and certain brand examples to show how what's working with the brand, what's not working with the brand, what doesn't exist with the brand, and what are the certain things that their competitors are doing better than them or worse than them, and how they can change their game. So I think a health check or an MOT is a pretty good way of describing a brand workshop for a company that thinks it has a brand, but is probably not using it to its best advantage.
And what would be the components of the output of that? What would you, at the end of that workshop, what would the team have defined?
Yeah, a really good question. No, the outputs, I mean, the first part of any brand workshop is usually the objective audit of myself and my colleagues, my team, would go out and see how that current brand is communicating across media, how its competitors are competing, how maybe some other examples in other markets, in Australia or America, might be communicating. Just so an audit to try and get a view of what the world in their category, how the world in their category is communicating. Then if you present that audit as the first step of the workshop, it's quite good in terms of pointing out where a brand is succeeding, where a brand is failing, and where a brand is not considered certain new aspects it needs to be doing. Certainly, a lot of brands keep on sending out huge copywriting briefs. Sorry, no examples here, but send out copywriting briefs when you kind of turn around and say, wouldn't this be better as a video? Or wouldn't this be better as an animation? Or wouldn't this be better as a podcast? Because, people don't read as much and people share video a lot more. That's a sideshow. But so what a workshop would do that audit. Then you'd spend a day, and it's usually 2 sessions now via Zoom, where you'd kind of then go, okay, well, let's ask some basic questions. What are the attributes of your brand? Then what are the benefits of using your brand? Then what are the values of your brand? Then what's the personality? What's the tone of voice? What's the style that you want to communicate about your brand? Because if we get those 4 axes right, then we can begin to understand what the brand promise is at the heart of that. And of course, for some brands, it moves on from brand promise into brand purpose. But once we define what that brand promise is, then we can check everything they're doing and saying, are you delivering that promise coherently, clearly? Have you thought about the best ways to communicate that, et cetera, et cetera? So once you've decided the promise, you then work out how that's positioned versus your competitors. So there'll be a positioning exercise. And the deliverables out of a workshop then would be a report saying, this is what you said, this is what we concluded, these are recommendations, and here's probably a creative brief and a communication brief which seem to be the sum of the parts. So a workshop is like all consultancy. It's really putting a mirror up to a company and sort of saying, this is how you're looking, this is how you look, and this is how you're speaking. Are you sure that's what you want to do, or are there things you'd like to enhance or add or change? So, as I say, a brand health check is probably the best way of describing that.
It sounds great to sort of be able to surface those probably assumptions that maybe were different in everybody's head and have them on the same page, especially if you're going to start working with an external agency or a number of different external agencies to make sure there's a consistency, you could say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the weird thing is, in workshops, things pop up because you get different participants, usually with different agendas or different amounts of experience. And sometimes either the older heads or the newer recruits pop up and say something that nobody else had kind of heard in the same room before. And they go, actually, yes, I hadn't thought that about our brand. Maybe we should write that into our tone of voice. So a brand workshop does give a chance to people because there's no wrong answers, of course, in a brand workshop. It has to be, it would be pointless going to do a health check if you didn't tell the doctor what your symptoms were. And it'd be pointless having an MOT on your car if you didn't really realise you probably needed new tyres, if you know what I mean. I'm trying to find the right metaphors, but it's a great way of getting everyone around the table and actually just saying, are we doing everything that we believe is right? And does anyone disagree? Because if we disagree, we need to modify things so that we can all agree.
Well, great creativity comes out of those moments, though, doesn't it? And innovation.
It does. And of course, I love it because I use brand workshops for everything from branding, but also naming exercises for new products and services, writing creative briefs, because obviously if you're writing a creative brief with everyone, all the stakeholders around the table, and they agree what the brief is, then it's going to be much easier and much more focused and targeted when they start seeing the outcome of what they've briefed in. There's something that's really excellent about just getting people together to agree what they're trying to achieve. And then when you send things back to them, they then begin to understand that they've been part of creating the journey.
Yeah, that's so important because it creates a lot of energy, doesn't it, to a momentum. And we even see that in our projects that we do with clients when we implement CRM. It's sort of getting them in the same place together, talking about their project and their aspirations and expectations, getting them all on the same page. They're absolutely chomping at the bit. That's the sort of that moment of energy. There's nothing to match it, really. It's great to be a part of that.
No, I agree completely. And I know that, I use workshops specifically targeted to branding exercises, but I think workshops for all aspects of business, and particularly what you do in terms of CRM, it's critical to work out what's not working, what do we need to improve. So the additional exercise I do in a brand workshop is, what do we need to remove? What do we need to retain? What do we need to enhance and what do we need to add that we haven't got? And if you start thinking about that in all terms of business, it begins to help you modify what are the things you're trying to achieve with any new system you're inputting or any new brand communication you're trying to create. So I think workshops work in a really good way across all sorts of aspects of business.
Well, that's fascinating for me. So I've learned loads just from listening to you talk just there, Bill. Thank you. So I think if we then bring it back round to sort of talking about marketing. So obviously, once you've done the initial branding, how would you work with a client around more sort of marketing and building the marketing materials with that brand in mind?
Okay. Well, let's go back. Sorry, I'll go back. I do also lecture at universities and art colleges about branding. But if you go back to what I was saying earlier, that is, get your brand right, and then the marketing should be easier to do. Because if you think of the origin of the word brand, it's an Old Norse word. It means, literally to burn a mark into cattle. And it's sort of, branding has been around for 5,000 years, back to the Indus Valley. So branding cattle was all about ownership and all about claiming property and also being proud of the quality of that product. And if you then take that to cattle in the Wild West, where you branded your cattle so that you could find your cattle once you took it to the crowded markets, taking it to market is the next step after branding. So if you do branding right, you're claiming ownership, you're trying to talk about the quality of your service. Sorry, I use the cattle analogy because things don't change. And taking it to market is something different. So if you think about you're trying to claim ownership, you're trying to claim the quality of the promise of either your product or service, and you're creating the right language around that, the right tone of voice, the right visual equities, then you've got to ask yourself in terms of marketing, where are the people I need to speak to gathering? And if you can work out who they are, what the archetypes are, and where they're likely to gather, it then helps you in terms of the brand creation to create the right toolkit to do that. But then, of course, you need to go and work with other experts. I don't claim to be a marketing expert. I claim to be a branding expert. And I clearly differentiate them because I see branding as the start of the process. Marketing is about taking that brand with all of its elements into the different areas that you're talking about. So how are you going to advertise it? How are you going to use social media? How are you going to use PR? How are you going to use direct mail? All of the tools in terms of of digital marketing then come into play, and also other classic marketing techniques. So a good set of brand guidelines from my point of view will have predicted the kinds of things you might need. So for instance, what might the credits on any videos we create in YouTube look like? What might any sign-off in any GIFs that we're putting into Instagram look like? What should the tone of voice of the copywriting be if we're delivering articles to magazine or doing blogs? You'll be beginning to predict the kinds of things which all come from the core of the brand and providing those to the right marketing experts to then go and do their job. There are some companies that claim to be both branding and marketing, and I kind of think that's true if they're a large organization, but I think they are slightly different things.
So I know that one of the important components of brand is purpose. And I think that's also sort of when you look at companies' culture, you look at them, and I'm going through a lot of growth at the minute, so I'm recruiting quite a lot. So that whole sort of purpose, but also the brand has been really helpful to help me grow and attract the right people. But I think for a lot of organizations, maybe they need to take a step back and first of all, if they have a purpose, is it the right one? And maybe they don't even have a purpose. What's your advice to help organizations come up with the right purpose for their business? How do they know when they've got the right one as well?
This is a great question and probably one of the hot debates on LinkedIn at the moment. Do brands need to have purpose? Well, I've worked on different kinds of brands, and I tend to now, I'm beginning to work out that all brands should have a promise. And a brand is about a promise delivered, of course. And some brands should have a purpose, but some brands try and almost put a purpose on top of their brand, which is unnecessary. For instance, I'm working with one company at the moment that's doing a real innovation in environmental packaging. Now, for me, they've got a real purpose. I can see what they're doing in terms of for society and for the environment. And it's written, they would describe themselves as a purpose-driven brand, and it's true in what they're doing. I'm also working for an engineering company And they were talking about their purpose. And I kind of went, well, I think your promise is to do wonderful engineering. I'm not really sure that I'd put that into a purpose. So I'm beginning to distill purpose with what are you putting into society or the environment or into the wider, business for good. Promise is actually something that, dare I say, more rudimentary businesses and brands are probably delivering. And I think there is a fine line between the two.
I love that idea. So if you're struggling with a purpose, then maybe focus first on the promise.
Focus on the promise, because you have to, you have to have a guarantee for what you're doing. It goes back to, the history of, the quality of your product or service. It has to be a promise about what we're creating, why we're creating it, why we want to deliver it in the very best way we can, and why we want you to enjoy the experience. That's your promise. That's the promise delivered. And of course, more and more brands, and we'll go on to, I think, brand futures as something we've talked about before, and what's happening, what are my predictions next? I think more and more brands are beginning to realize that if they want to engage, that if they don't have purpose as part of what is their core product or service, they begin to think about ways they can contribute back to society through some of the profits they make. So you tend to find there are some companies who don't have a purpose at the heart of them. They're beginning to add elements of purpose into some of the other things that they do.
There's an organisation I know sort of a little bit. There was a Southeast Awards competition, and they won it in their category, Sussex Business of the Year Award, which is World of Books, and they also run Zifit. And I know what's really important to them is the whole circular economy and giving back and supporting charities and converting some of the donations they get into funding. And it's wonderful to see how purpose can actually create a commercial success, a whole ecosystem of commercial success. And I think it's probably been a really strong compass for their success and their growth as well.
I absolutely agree. I think once the dreaded word purpose popped out of the bag, because it's a relatively new term in terms of branding and marketing, it's really what we used to call proposition. But that just seems like a bit of a heavyweight word now. What are you proposing to do and how are you proposing to do it? But purpose, particularly in the digital age, is much more about what are you doing for good, and how are you telling people about it, and how can you make people feel and believe in what you're doing and trusting you. So trust and purpose has become so once companies start to think, what's our trust and purpose, it does make them rethink the way in which they operate.
Yeah. But the trick is actually executing on that then.
Oh, absolutely. And if you do it in a, dare I say, a fanciful or a surface where you'll be discovered, the great thing about marketing and branding is, in the dark ages, you could fool all of the people all of the time. I don't think that's true. It's now people are so brand and marketing savvy, they know when they're being told something and they don't believe it. And in fact, with a bit of investigation, they can uncover things. And when they do uncover it, of course, there can be a social clamour about it. So it's a really dangerous world if you're trying to say you're doing things and you're not. And, the whole legacy of what's fact and what's fake news and what's truth is a big part of what's going on with social, of course.
And the challenge is that that people have a voice now that can be heard. They can very quickly go on Twitter, complain about what you do. And I know my son bought me some slippers actually for Christmas from White Company, and they were, I don't know what he was thinking, but they were tiny. And so he sent them back, and he's been waiting over a month for a refund, and he's been going on and doing the chatbot, and I suspect there's either an element of people home working and them not having the right sort of joined up systems with finance of where they are in the process of a refund. But I tell you what, my 16-year-old has not hung back on social media, and he's been looking at Trust to Trade and seeing what reviews people are reading, and I think it has amused him. He doesn't take it all too seriously, and I think he's confident eventually he'll get a refund. But it's been really eye-opening because they are probably one of the most trusted brands for me personally, and to sort of see them really struggle on delivering on their brand is really it's sad, I guess, as well to see.
Well, I think that this, and that, again, we'll come on to how this is going to affect the future. The weird thing about the lockdown is it's forced companies to trust their employees will work from home. Obviously, lots of employees have been asking to work from home for years, But of course, lots of organisations don't like it because they don't think they trust their people to do it. Are they going to do the 9 to 5? Of course, in working from home, it's proved to lots of organisations that people have been more productive. And people have actually been more efficient because they're working at a time that suits them in a way that suits them. However, the downside of that is exactly what you said, is sometimes it's shown that organisations, when they're not under one roof, are actually missing out on fairly important things in terms of service and delivery. So I think this lockdown and home working is beginning to expose those companies who are doing things well, those companies who are doing things badly, and also beginning to make particularly agencies in the world I work in realise that actually people can be very productive and enjoy working from home. So I think everything's going to change in the way we work, and everything's going to change in the way that companies are delivering what they're supposed to be doing. So I suspect in the white company example, because there's nobody cracking the whip, it's just falling between the gaps.
Yeah, well, they might have even outsourced that part of the business, which means loss of control.
And that's a whole other kettle of fish.
Yeah. So I guess maybe after you've got this amazing brand, and you might have had the absolute privilege of working with somebody like yourself, Bill, to put that together, you almost need to sort of go through an audit of your whole customer journey and work out where are you sort of breaking that promise, and where are the sort of improvements in processes. Maybe they haven't even got the systems in place, like with my company, maybe they haven't got joined up visibility of where the refund is, for example, or giving information that's relevant to that client. They're just generically looking off a knowledge base, for example. So it's not as meaningful.
Yeah, I think you know, a brand, a brief for creating a brand or refreshing a brand is not a long document, but a part of it will be, the key part of it is who are you talking to, who are your targets, you know, through what channels, and what do you want the call to action to be? And if you start thinking about that, it then means that in terms of the brand design elements you're creating, you're also beginning to ask questions about how people are currently doing things. So sometimes the questions provoke different answers, which are nothing to do with the brand. They're different. They're to do with service qualities, or to do with productivity or production, or other things which are out of the brand. My kind of consultancy role.
So I have a question, Bill. In terms of brand, then, as far as advertising your brand, if you could only do it on one platform, where would you suggest? Is it your website, or is it one of the social platforms like Twitter or LinkedIn? What are you seeing in the market around that?
Well, the whole point is you have got it completely wrong if you're only using one platform, because the whole way that Google works is it likes to see activity across a number of fronts. It's like spinning plates. So if you want to have either improved organic search, or improved SEO, or improved earned media, what you should be doing is at the hub of that is your own website. But the satellites is you should be having embassies on other people's platforms. By embassies, you should be having your Instagram page if you're on fashion. You should have your YouTube page if you're music. You should have your LinkedIn page if you're B2B. But usually it's going to be your website at the core, and a couple of social platforms which are right for your business, your category, that you're making sure you're reposting things on, and also posting things back, so that Google sees you spidering the web. It sees conversations going on in two places. So that's one of the basics of digital marketing is you can't just do it in one area. You have to have conversations between sites.
So I know you've worked in the music industry, and I believe you've even had your own record label. So when you think about brand in the context of a celebrity, a performer, or an individual, tell us more about sort of how brand is important to them, and what you've seen, what the sort of trends have been over the last few years about how they need to reinvent themselves. If you look at people like Madonna or Lady Gaga. Yeah. So tell us more about your world of, from the music perspective, about brand.
Well, I mean, personal branding in the music business is astonishing. I mean, Lady Gaga is the exemplar of just doing it brilliantly. She's completely reinvented herself. I forget her original name, but I think it's a Brooklyn name. But no, Lady Gaga has learned from Madonna. She's Generation 2 Madonna, really. No, personal branding is a very, very different subject. And I've lectured on courses about that. And of course, I've helped on courses about personal branding, because lots of students who are trying to launch themselves in the market are trying to understand how to differentiate themselves from their competitors. So working out how they talk about the things they do, how they talk about their passions, how they bring some of their personality to the fore, because it's really hard, particularly for graduates, to start to brand themselves personally. But there are lessons to be learnt from the Lady Gagas of this world, which is to make sure that you do things with a passion, you try and be different, you try and make sure that the things you love come to the fore. You don't try and do things that you think you have to do because they're the norm. Points of valid difference are things that you should celebrate. I remember I recruited a designer many years ago who ended up being one of my best designers. And she was very apologetic and saying, I've only just come into graphic design because I couldn't get a job in textile design. And she ended up being one of my very best designers because she thought like a textile designer. Her designs were beautiful. They were layered, they were patterned, they used colors in a more imaginative way. So in other words, she reinvented herself, but used things were actually true to herself. So when it comes back, sorry, it's a circular conversation, but when it comes to personal branding, it's finding the things that are different and accentuating the positive. I know that's an old Bing Crosby song, but it's still true to this day.
Fantastic. And you mentioned when we recently spoke that you've seen some fantastic creativity during this lockdown with various artists. Which have there been any in particular that have sort of impressed you?
I mean, I do think that some of the, my favourite music of the moment has been Roisin Murphy. Is that how you pronounce her name? Who used to be of Moloko. She's doing home videos for her music, which are just fantastic because she's using effects in her videos that they may be home videos, but it's almost like she's created this her whole universe within her living room. And obviously it's got lots of special effects she's putting into there, but they're just funny and entertaining. And she starts them as live broadcasts for her fans, but they've been hugely popular on YouTube. So yes, Roisin Murphy is one that I would say do look at what she's been doing because she's turned home video into an art form. And of course, there's been lots of home video stuff being done of people performing from home, but hers have just taken on a sort of both funny and stellar quality.
That sounds really inspiring. It's amazing what you can do on a budget, isn't it?
That's one of the other things that this is proving is good marketing doesn't have to be expensive. It has to be inspired. It has to be clever. It has to be different. It has to have a point. I hate marketing that's pointless, and you see a lot of it around where it's repetitive or it follows the industry norm. I do think celebrate the difference is what I'd say to every brand I work on. Find out the things which are truly different about yourself. And they may just be small things, but you have to sort of accentuate them.
I know when I started my business, I was actually, as a Microsoft partner, I moved immediately to the Alps where I stayed for 4 years. Unfortunately, I actually had a ski accident and tore my ACL. So that meant it was hard to come back to the UK because at Geneva Airport, if you've ever been there, there's steps to get onto the aircraft. You have to climb up. You have to go outside and up the steps. So trying to do that on crutches or with a torn ACL is not so good. And actually then I had a baby. So flying when you're pregnant and a young child is not so good. So I was basically in this sort of isolated period of time for 4 years where I didn't meet any other Microsoft partners, had no idea of what was the norm, but I naively, you could say, thought that actually they all did the same as me. And it's been a delightful journey for me, and they're a very friendly community of partners to sort of discover our differences. And I think it is a thing to be celebrated, really, because the market is huge, typically for what most companies do. Yeah. So actually really zoning in on those differences can be a really fantastic thing as well.
Does the Alp experience or the Alpine experience, is that why you're Cloud 9? Is that where you were at the peak of the Alps? Is that what you
Good question.
Yeah, well, the Cloud 9 came about because over a napkin, as these things do, is because I have this idea of Cloud 9 surely is a happy place. Yeah. But it wasn't until over the years, I've been going for over 10 years now, that I've realized and discovered that, do you know what, in the UK, we might call Cloud 9 a happy place, but in other countries, it might be Cloud 7, Cloud 11. Absolutely. And so, yeah, it just goes to show I shouldn't have assumed anything, but it served us well because at the time when we started our business, the trend was we were at the beginning of the trend of companies moving to the cloud. And so we really wanted to highlight that because there was a lot of companies that still didn't really, especially you could say, partners delivering these projects, they were looking to implement it on old rusty computers in their office, not really pushing to deliver solutions on the cloud. So we were trying to differentiate what we did at that time, and now I think most companies are deploying cloud solutions, which is great for us. We don't have to educate them on why that's a good thing, which is great for us.
Well, I think, one of the interesting questions I often ask people, particularly when I'm working on a brand refresh, is when you ask people why they called the company what they did, as long as it's not their surnames, of course, then that's fairly typical. But often the story behind how they came up with the name tells you a lot about their brand philosophy, and I think it's really interesting. Obviously, I think your name is spot on, not only because it's one of my favourite Temptations songs as well. That's my thing, which is all, Cloud9, be what you want to be, which is great. The lyrics for Cloud9 by Temptations are perfect for your business. But when you ask people about why they came up with the name or even look at their business, often the stories will be, some of it will be smart and objective, sometimes it will be purely subjective, and sometimes it will just be wacky. And actually, there's no wrong answers, but once you uncover why people have done what they've done, a bit about their story, you then can go, stop there. That bit of your story is really interesting. We ought to focus on that. It's the clever thing that, I'm obsessed, maybe because I've been drinking too much in lockdown, but I do love the way that when you read the back of a bottle of wine and you learn about the sort of terroir, where the grapes were grown or the winemaker's philosophy, I think wines are brilliant because when you think about it, if you didn't read the back of the label, you might not know anything about it. But you start reading the story behind the product, and there's lovely stories. And I think that winemaking stories have influenced a lot of storytelling. For instance, when Innocent launched as a brand, it was brilliant in the way it talked about its product and brand in a way that nobody else did. It actually didn't talk about, it was fun and approachable and conversational. And again, a bit like Apple in terms of brand identity, Innocent started a whole movement of starting to speak without using technobabble, just being honest and being just frank about what you do and why you do it. Honesty about ingredients, honesty about the process, honesty about the benefits. These things are important. So when it comes to your initial point about calling yourself Cloud9, it's an interesting story. And I would sort of say that sometimes you should sort of say, it's because you weren't immersed in something, you saw it with a clear head. Your Cloud9 is a kind of head above the clouds, really.
Yep. And do you have any tips on companies, or maybe there's people listening to this that are budding entrepreneurs, they haven't quite set up their business? What would be your top tips for considering an appropriate name for their business?
It's a really good one. Two of the projects I'm working on are actually naming new brands. And of course, the problem with naming is it's a very clustered world now, particularly when you're trying to say to people, you really need to claim a .com if you can. Of course, that space is getting completely full. So you have to be more imaginative. But also, you have to think about doing naming is trying to think out. You're trying to brand yourself in a market, and you've got to think where the gap is in that market and how you can market in that gap. And also, your brand name should reflect something about your business personality. And there are certain things in terms of brand naming. They can be logical, they can be literal, they can be crazy, they can be left field. But any name should reflect something about the company itself. It should something about the character of the company.
Yeah, and I think that brings back through that thread that you've been talking about, Bill, about authenticity. I guess that comes in as well.
Yeah, and don't just do something because it sounds funny over a drink with mates. It's just, and there are too many brand names like that.
Yeah, I guess there probably is. So coming round then to your predictions for the future. So what do you think the future holds in the world of branding? What are you seeing and what are the sort of guess around where we'll be maybe in 5-10 years' time?
Yeah, well, I think I'd be earning a lot more money if I could do 10 years' time. I think I can see, certainly I think that we're going to see a lot more truth. I think this whole cluster about fake news and facts that's been obviously clustered by a Trump era and also a lot of news organizations, I think making sense of confusion is going to be something. And also where businesses for good have more empathy as well. So I think trying to make sense of the massive confusion is going to be something very important. So I think companies are going to open up more, and obviously they're going to talk about their sustainability. I think brands are going to focus much more on the home as well. One of the brands I created, B&Q, the identity, they've had a roaring trade during the last year, of course, because I think home is where the heart is. And I moved to Brighton to work from home 5 or 6 years ago. So I often claim that I'm Nostradamus. Working from home has been part of my life for past several years or so. But I think people begin to realise that the home is very important, which is why you're seeing this huge shift of companies moving out of London, people moving out of London, people moving into the country. I know Brighton itself is being inundated. So I think you're going to see a lot of things about brands talking about home is where the heart is. They're going to be talking a lot about that because it is to do with family, it's to do with environment, it's to do with personal goals, it's going to do with more comfortable ways of working. It's going to talk about the technology you use to set up home offices. But I think the big thing that's going to happen in branding is it's only a century ago we had the Roaring Twenties. Remember, after the Great War, suddenly money flooded back into drink, good times, fashion. I think when and if this is ever over, I think we're going to have a second Roaring Twenties. And I think lots of brands are going to focus on that.
Oh, that'd be great, because one of the sectors that we were quite heavily involved with before the first lockdown was hospitality and leisure, and it's tragic to see how badly they've been affected, and even like the airline industries. And I think I couldn't be happier to see them benefit tremendously from any uptake while we enjoy the good times again.
Yeah.
Well, I think that there'll be lots of organisations, unfortunately, lots of organisations that have gone out of business. I think there are lots of organisations who'll be reframing what they do when times will get good again. And I think you're seeing lots of bright people who may have chosen or have been forced to lose their current career, as you talked about earlier, who will be having entrepreneurial thoughts about what is next and right to try and capture people's attention and make them have good times and make them spend money again.
Mm.
So I think so my predictions are definitely about the Roaring Twenties is going to come back. Definitely about entrepreneurship, because lots of new businesses are going to start up because people have had time to sit back and say what it is that I can do that I really always wanted to do, that I have the ability to do now. And I think a lot more about truth and empathy.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's important. Like I know in my past, I've sort of worked a lot with corporates, and you go to their sort of corporate facade of their offices, and we're also real now and vulnerable in our home offices, being sort of interrupted by our kids and pets and laundry in the background or whatever. So I think being real and authentic is definitely welcomed now, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, we still have a studio here in Brighton that we go to every now and again, and we go socially distanced, and we usually make sure one or two of us go in, but not the whole lot at the same time. But even we're doing it probably just to escape from the house. So I think there's going to be a combination of, and I've spoken to friends who work in city agencies who are saying they're all talking now about having smaller central offices and doing part of their time working in offices and part of their time working at home. And that means there's going to be a lot more focus on the type of home setup you have. So I think businesses which are going to be into furniture, paint, furnishings, software, networks, they're all going to be thriving.
Yeah, it would be great fun to be a part of reinventing the office as a community fun space.
Yeah.
Somebody suggested in our team that we should get an ice cream maker. But I've always wanted to be able to, those machines where you sort of pour the sort of the whipped ice. But we'll see. So just finishing up, out of interest, what are your most inspiring books or podcasts that you might want to share with people listening?
Yeah, it's probably, I mean, weirdly, I love books, and I haven't been reading enough, if I'm being honest with books. I've been reading lots of articles, as I think we all do online. I've been getting a daily newspaper again for the first time in ages, which is just because sometimes I think I just want to be away from the screen because of work. The book that kind of I read at the beginning of last year, which I still go back to, and I've mentioned this to people before, is The Body by Bill Bryson. And if you don't know Bill Bryson, he normally writes about travel.
Mm.
He's a very witty writer. He's a former independent journalist. And he's written some great books about travel in America, travel around Britain, travel around Australia, etc. But he wrote the body because he realised as he's getting older that he, as a journeyman, didn't know enough about biochemistry. So he writes a book which is a journey around the body. And of course, it couldn't be more timely for now. So the chapter all about the immune system, I just found fascinating. And it's one of the last chapters in the book. And it almost kind of predicts things, because at the end of the chapter, it says that one of the specialists he speaks to says that, medicine is, we're well covered now, but, there is a crisis that's going to happen in the future. So I kind of have read the book voraciously and recommend it to friends, because it has made me think about, why should we take vitamin D? Or why should we do regular exercise? Why is it important to think about your diet and nutrition? So it's a very good reflection, but based on science. So it's not Bill Bryson's opinions. It's Bill Bryson speaking to experts in their fields about things about maintaining your health and sanity, really.
That sounds great. I'm sure my teenage kids would love that too. So
it's great and entertaining, and I fully recommend. In terms of podcasts, I probably have to, this is where I have to declare self-interest. I'm involved in a community here in Brighton called the Kitchen Table Community, which is started up by John Ashton, who runs an agency called Right Arm, and they're a copywriting agency. And he was a copywriter himself, but he set up Right Arm to run an agency of copywriters because he realised he could be more successful as a businessman with lots of people on his books than being a lone wolf. And he wrote the Kitchen Table Method, which is a book about starting your own business from a kitchen table, which has been read by, I know, lots of people with entrepreneurial ideas. And he set up the Kitchen Table Community so that people in different industries can work together on projects, a bit like people on working on a film production. They come together for the making of that film, and then they all leave and go on to other projects. And the ideology behind the Kitchen Method Community is people come together, bringing their own expertise, and then going off and doing other things. But what's good about it is he's got podcasts on the Kitchen Table Community where different people talk about their expertise. So people are learning from each other.
That sounds amazing.
So that's all been really interesting, Bill. I've really enjoyed listening to you talk about branding and your book recommendation. Definitely, I'm going to make sure I order that this afternoon. So as a final question then, where can people find you? Where can we find you online?
Well, because I'm an independent, of course, my main site, if you want to know about what I do in business, it would be LinkedIn. If you want to know what I do for fun, it would be on Instagram. If you want to know what I do with family and friends, it would be on Facebook. And if you want to hear my music, it will be on Mixcloud. But really, most people find me either through LinkedIn or through the two businesses I'm most closely related to. And that's the Brighton business, Neujuice. We do digital first brands. And my London agency, Studio BLUP. We do social media content.
Fantastic.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Bill, for joining us today. We really enjoyed learning about your journey and all your inspiring ideas for helping organizations with their brand strategy. And for anyone listening that would like to hear more about future podcasts coming up or more details and how to contact Bill, you can go to www.cloud9insight.com/podcasts. So goodbye for now and see you next time.
Thanks. Bye.